Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about human rights and government policy. Some of our biggest social problems involve discrimination, economics, and hatred. In the past year and a half, we have seen what our society actually holds dear, who is to be protected and who is to be left behind. We have seen by the holes in healthcare, especially global healthcare and vaccination programs, who is truly a valuable member of our global society and who is not. We have seen by way of those who have received protection from potential infection of the virus and who actually hasn't, through the distribution of vaccines, and who by way of economics holds importance by that same distribution of vaccines. We have seen the WHO out there asking countries to donate doses of vaccine to countries that are having trouble affording vaccine doses, while at the same time we listen to G7 leaders talk about how we need to eliminate the virus everywhere so everyone can be protected from the virus, meaning that we have to get those vaccine doses to all those people around the world so that we can raise the rates of vaccination in order to protect everyone from COVID-19. We have also seen people who are visible minorities, women, and those who hold lower economic status suffer the most from infections, suffer the most from lack of health care because of limited travel. We have seen levels of public service left exposed to infection. Teachers have been left in schools where the COVID protection plans were flimsy at best. We have seen in the past week a member of parliament step down because she was made to feel she didn't belong on Parliament Hill, even though the constituents who voted for her sent her there because they needed help in their community. We have heard about systemic racism within social systems, not just the police, but we've seen it in healthcare. We've seen it in many other areas. We have listened to how we will study that and we'll learn how to fix the problem with a lot of lip service but little action. One of the biggest killers globally, as studied by the WHO, is suicide. And they are imploring all of our countries globally to instill suicide prevention programs, because it is probably the world's biggest killer. If it isn't the world's biggest killer, it is the most preventable killer in the world that we can prevent through programs of mental health and social belonging, suicide from happening. So today is about that: discrimination, hatred, systemic prejudices and discrimination, as well as a big killer, suicide. So let's listen to what has happened and listen to the messages that are coming about, especially ones that will help us prevent suicide. Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Mumilaaq Qaqqaq is a courageous woman. She is a woman who is standing up for her people. She is a woman who ran for office with the idea of helping the Inuit people of Nunavut. They're trying to bring resources to help her people thrive and grow, to help them get out of, as she would call it, survival mode. Trying to break down the barriers of racism and systems that were built on the backs of the indigenous people, but yet they were built to suppress the indigenous people. She has been working with the NDP and Jagmeet Singh to try to bring about real change for a group of people who need that change, while the rest of Canada is thriving, living well, receiving high-tech medical aid, and having stable roofs over our heads. The Inuit people of Nunavut have been struggling just to get the basics, just to be able to move from what would be third world conditions into livable conditions. Mumilaaq Qaqqaq has stepped down from that office because of the level of racism, the profiling, and the feeling that she isn't safe on Parliament Hill. So let's listen to what she had to say in her exit speech, and then we'll listen to what Jagmeet Singh has to say in a press conference after that announcement. So let's move forward with that, and keep in mind that some way, somehow, we have to end the hatred and the racism that is being dealt out within the borders of Canada.
Matna. Mr. Speaker, every time I walk onto House of Common grounds, speak in these chambers, I am reminded every step of the way I don't belong here. I have never felt safe or protected in my position, especially within the House of Commons. Often having pep talks with myself in the elevator or taking a moment in the bathroom stall to maintain my composure. When I walk through these doors, not only am I reminded of the clear colonial house on fire I am willingly walking into, I am already in survival mode. Since being elected, I expect to be stopped by security at my workplace. I've had security jog after me down hallways, nearly put their hands on me, and racial profile me as a member of parliament. I know what to do in these situations. My life in Canada, and especially through this experience, has taught me many things. As a brown woman, do not move too quickly or suddenly. Do not raise your voice. Do not make a scene. Maintain eye contact. And don't hide your hands. Every Inuk has survival mode. We have to. No, not 2 generations ago, survival mode meant endurance of extreme temperatures and finding food throughout the winter. Now survival mode means being able to see that warmth in shelter and affordability in livelihood, but being denied it at the hands of the federal government. The federal institution needs to change its own policies and procedures to reflect reality instead of creating barriers for people like me. I shouldn't be afraid of going into work. No one should be afraid of going into work. It is possible to create change. It can be started here in the House of Commons and reflected in Canada. There is a refusal and unwillingness for change, not an inability to accomplish it. People like me don't belong here in the federal institution. I'm a human being who wants to use this institution to help people, but the reality is that this institution and the country has been created off the backs, trauma, and displacement of Indigenous people. Even if we're told we should run, we still face huge barriers. Young people have been told they are not experienced enough, not ready to lead. Women have been told to sit pretty and listen. Disabled individuals have been shown they aren't even worth the conversations, and Inuit kill themselves at the highest rate in the country. We are facing a suicide epidemic, and this institution refuses to care. During my time in this chamber, I have heard so many pretty words like reconciliation, diversity, and inclusion. I have been called courageous, brave, and strong by people outside of my party. But let me be honest, brutally honest, nice words with no action hurt when they are uttered by those with power over the federal institution and refuse to take action. There is nothing to take pride in the legacy this institution continues to not only maintain, but to build and fuel. People in power have choices, and they consistently choose priorities that uphold systems of oppression, leaving babies sick in moldy homes, parents missing their passed on children because these powerful individuals don't think change is worth the money. Recently, I asked a minister what he would do in my shoes. If his riding had the highest rates of suicide, with the most homes in need of repair, if women and girls were going missing in his community and children were being into the foster care system without regard for their well-being, how would he feel? I asked if the minister would change his answer if I told him to keep waiting. And he couldn't answer me. He said he would never even try to place himself in my shoes. But that's exactly what the problem is. Inuit have been telling those with power and ability to make change to try and survive in their shoes for 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. They couldn't. Maybe it is impossible for ministers to understand what we go through every day, but I am urging you, telling you to listen, believe us, and do something about it. When we tell you to act now, you need to act now. And if you understand, then shame on you. Because if you understand how much this hurts, you understand how deep it cuts. It would be easier for me to be told that I am wrong and that you disagree than to be told I am right and I'm courageous, but there is no room in your budget for basic human rights that so many others take for granted. You see, Mr. Speaker, I don't belong here. But my presence, I hope, is starting to crack the foundations of this very federal institution that started colonizing Inuit barely 70 years ago. I realize that this is difficult for some members to hear, but it's the reality and the truth. This place was built on the oppression of Indigenous peoples. People like my grandfather who were born and raised on the land but forcibly relocated into settlement that was financed and built by the federal institution. Our history is stained with blood. Children, youth, adults, and elders' blood. It's time to face the scale of justice. On one side, we have a mountain of suffering, and whenever the government gives us a grain of sand of support, they seem to think the trauma from our past has been rectified, that somehow they deserve a pat on the back. But it will take a mountain of support to even begin the healing process. As long as these halls echo with empty promises instead of real action, I will not belong here. Although I may not belong in this institution, I do belong in my party. The NDP has always been a party committed to uplifting voices of all different backgrounds, often ignored by the federal institution. I'd like to thank my leader, the member for Burnaby South, for listening to me and making me feel safe and comfortable to voice what I need to. While members from other parties have come to me asking me to advocate for an issue their party's focus to retouch, I never felt muzzled by the NDP. I could never join another party, and I am a proud New Democrat. Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to members from Westminster, Burnaby, North Island, Powell River, and especially Hamilton Centre for always having my back. Without my NDP colleagues, I wouldn't have such a great platform that is true in the want to do more, to do better, and to do right. I'd also like to thank, of course, my number one supports, my mother and father, Pia and Jimmy, and my brother Lars, for everything from day one. A huge shout out to my staff. I could not have survived without you guys. All the things that come out of my office, everything I'm so proud of, I know I couldn't have done it with you. I'm so grateful for you. Of course, ultimately, thank you from the bottom of my heart to Inuit and Nunavut who believe in me and support me. The encouraging messages have meant more than people will ever know. I'd like to thank Bautatik for always standing up for Inuit women and girls like me and speaking truth to power even when it's inconvenient. I will always fight for human rights of Indigenous peoples in Nunavut and across the country. I believe that we are living through a shift in this country where Canadians are starting to wake up to the reality. I'm looking forward to a time where people like me could belong here, a time we can be here. I hope another young or Inuk or woman or all three will follow in my footsteps and continue pushing this institution to support Indigenous peoples in Canada. I have shown the nation and the world that impossible is possible, that hope can grow where it's purposely put out, and that if we work together and use our voices, we can influence real change. I will always believe politics can look, feel, and be different. It can, it has, it started. We will keep it going. We must all ensure it does. Matna, Mr. Speaker.
And this is from Jagmeet Singh. He has always spoke out against racism. He knows what it's like to have that profiler, or that person profile you because you are not what they think you should be, that they think that you could be some sort of a terrorist or some sort of a security threat. He knows what that feels like, and he knows what it means to seek equality for everyone. So let's listen to what Jagmeet Singh has to say now.
Saying from the beginning, as long as people need help, we should be able to provide that support to those people. It is callous and it is thoughtless to cut the help that families need while we are still in this pandemic. There are still potential additional waves. We need that help to continue at the same level. So we're going to continue to apply pressure on the Liberal government not to cut the help to people by $800, which is what they're proposing to do, and to reinstate the full support that people receive so they can continue to get by in this tough time. Secondly, we have called on this government to stop fighting Indigenous kids in court. Let us be very clear. Those court dates are happening. One just happened on Monday. The court dates continue where the Liberal government and Justin Trudeau are taking Indigenous kids to court. They're fighting Indigenous kids despite a Human Rights Tribunal decision that states clearly that the Canadian government willfully and recklessly discriminated against these kids. Despite that discrimination, this Liberal government and Justin Trudeau are appealing that at the federal court. They are fighting that decision. We are calling on them to stop this legal battle, follow through with the orders, the over 19 orders issued by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and walk the path of reconciliation. The deadline for a motion that we passed, which was also successful in calling on this government to stop the legal battles and to give us an update on their steps to stop these legal battles, as well as implementing all of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. That deadline, that 10-day deadline, is tomorrow. So we're also waiting to see if this Liberal government is going to follow through on the progress report that we called on this government to do. In fact, all parliamentarians who voted in favor of this motion, our motion, to push this government, this Liberal government, to do something. So those are the two things that I wanted to raise with you. We are going to continue to fight for justice, continue to fight for families and people that need help, and continue to fight for Indigenous people that deserve dignity and respect.
Donc aujourd'hui, je vais toucher deux enjeux. Premièrement, c'est le fait que le gouvernement libéral va couper l'aide aux familles de $800 7 juillet. Ça veut dire dans quelques semaines, ce gouvernement libéral va couper l'aide aux familles qui en ont besoin. On sait que la pandémie n'est pas finie. On a toujours une grande menace de cette pandémie et les potentielles fermetures dans l'avenir. On sait que presque 2 millions de personnes dépend sur la PCRE et c'est essentiel que le même niveau d'appui continue. Le gouvernement libéral et Justin Trudeau ils ont déjà annoncé dans leur proposition de couper cette aide. On rejette cette approche, on dit que c'est une mauvaise approche et le gouvernement libéral doit renverser leur décision. Justin Trudeau doit renverser sa décision. Deuxièmement, notre motion pour arrêter les batailles en justice contre les enfants autochtones, ça continue. Les batailles continuent, malgré le fait qu'on ait passé une motion qui déclare clairement que le gouvernement libéral doit arrêter ces batailles, arrêter de poursuivre en justice les enfants autochtones. Ce sont les enfants autochtones que le tribunal de la droit de la personne du Canada a décidé. Ils étaient discriminés clairement et malgré ça, le gouvernement libéral et Justin Trudeau continuent de les poursuivre en justice. Donc, on continue de mettre la pression pour arrêter. Et en plus, demain, c'est la date où dans notre motion, on a dit que le gouvernement libéral doit donner un rapport pour montrer ce qu'ils ont fait pour suivre la motion qui était passée dans la Chambre des communs. Ça veut dire qu'est-ce qu'ils ont fait pour mise en œuvre les appels à l'action ou qu'est-ce qu'ils ont fait pour arrêter les batailles légales contre la communauté autochtone. Donc, on va voir demain si le gouvernement fait quelque chose, s'il donne un rapport ou non. Et donc, on va voir demain. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. Je suis prêt pour vos questions. I'm ready for your questions now.
And we'll all take questions, starting with questions on the phone. As usual, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions, commençons par les questions au téléphone. Comme à l'habitude, une question de suivi. Opérateur, avons-nous une première question?
Oui, merci. La première question est de Raymond Filion de TVA. La parole est à vous.
Merci. Bonjour, M. Singh.
Bonjour.
J'aimerais vous entendre au sujet de la motion du Bloc qui va faire l'objet d'un vote cet après-midi. Est-ce que tous vos députés vont voter en faveur de la motion ou il y en a quelques-uns et quelques-unes qui s'opposent, qui sont mal à l'aise face à ce qui est proposé?
Cette motion, c'est une motion qu'on appuie, c'est une motion qu'on a déjà dit, ça suit nos valeurs et c'est clairement quelque chose qui est important pour le Québec. Donc, on va appuyer cette motion. Et moi, comme chef, j'étais clair que c'était quelque chose qui suivent nos valeurs et effectivement, comme le Parti néo-démocrate, on était là pour défendre la langue française à plusieurs reprises. On va continuer d'être là pour défendre la langue française et aussi d'avancer la justice pour les gens du Québec.
Donc, tous vos députés, sans exception, vont voter en faveur de la motion?
On va appuyer cette motion. Et c'est la position de notre parti d'appuyer cette motion.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Oui, merci. La prochaine question est de Catherine Lévesque de la Presse canadienne. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Singh.
Bonjour.
Un peu dans la même veine, parce qu'en fait, il y a plusieurs motions là, qui vont être soumises au vote tout à l'heure.
Oui.
À commencer, je veux juste m'assurer de savoir de laquelle vous veniez de parler. Est-ce qu'on parle bien de la loi 101 dans les entreprises sous juridiction fédérale? Vous allez voter en faveur de ça, si je comprends bien.
Oui, on va voter en faveur de cette motion aussi, mais l'autre motion, c'était la motion, je pense, sur ce que
La Constitution.
Exactement, sur la Constitution, exactement.
OK, d'accord. Si je peux juste me permettre mes deux questions. Si on commence par la loi 101, donc vous dites que oui, vous allez voter en faveur, mais pensez-vous que les libéraux devraient voter pour également, puisque ça vient faire environ la même chose que la modernisation des langues officielles qui a été présentée hier?
Donc, je veux souligner quelque chose ici, que le gouvernement libéral a proposé un projet de loi hier à la dernière moment. On sait que le gouvernement libéral est en train de déclencher une élection cet été ou dans l'automne. Donc, c'est effectivement un geste symbolique. Et on va suivre avec précision si le gouvernement veut vraiment, honnêtement faire quelque chose pour moderniser la langue, une langue qui doit être modernisée. Si il veut le faire, on a le temps, on a 2 ans pour passer ce projet de loi. Mais si c'était seulement un geste symbolique, on va voir quand le gouvernement décide de déclencher l'élection. S'il décide de le faire cet été ou dans l'automne, ça veut dire que cette geste hier, c'était seulement un geste symbolique. Pour nous, on veut effectivement passer les lois qui défendent la langue française au Québec et à travers le pays. C'est essentiel. Et un élément de ça, c'est la modernisation de la langue de la loi sur les langues officielles, mais aussi plusieurs autres exemples de mettre en œuvre la loi 101 au niveau fédéral. On peut le faire. Si le gouvernement veut le faire, on va voir. OK.
Et sur cet autre vote, donc le droit du Québec de modifier la Constitution, il y a au moins une de vos députées, Léa Gazan, là, qui s'est inquiétée hier pendant le débat que cette motion, en fait, pourrait avoir un effet sur les langues autochtones. Je me demandais, est-ce que vous avez l'assurance que tous vos députés, même Mme Gazan, vont quand même voter en faveur de cette motion?
L'inquiétude qui touche les langues autochtones, c'est une inquiétude qui a raison et c'est une inquiétude importante. On sait qu'au Canada, depuis longtemps, les langues autochtones étaient menacées, donc on doit mettre plus des efforts pour protéger les langues autochtones, de défendre les langues autochtones. Donc ça, c'est quelque chose de tellement important et c'est une inquiétude qui est vraiment une grave inquiétude.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question is from Charlie Pinkerton of iPolitics. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Good afternoon, Mr. Singh.
Good afternoon.
My questions are my questions are actually related to the motion today from Jack Harris,
Yes.
M62 on dental care. Please excuse me if this was asked about in French, but assuming that Liberal MPs vote down this motion today as debate on it seems to suggest, what do you think that shows about the Liberals' I guess, commitment on something like this, as they've sort of indicated they're open to study? And as well, where does that position you and your party, given that before the last election and after as well, dental care and improving federal coverage for dental care was something that you had indicated was, was something that the NDP would only give their support to the government for if they themselves adopted?
Dental care is really important. When I've spoken to people across the country, they tell me that this is one of the most costly, important parts of their health that they are not actually spending money on because they can't afford to. I've heard from so many people who tell me that their dental health is failing and they can't afford to fix it. I've met with people in my own riding in Burnaby South who came to me, and during the meeting, the woman that came to me could not remove her hand from her covering her mouth because she was so embarrassed by her teeth, and how this is impacting people's ability to get employment, their quality of life, and their health. And it is very arbitrary that you could go into a hospital and get open heart surgery, but if you've got a problem with your teeth, you can't have any help. That is a serious problem. And so what we are proposing is a way to fix that. And our proposition would actually cover a significant number of Canadians immediately, with a view to putting in place universal dental care in the future. But we could immediately cover the people who need it most with a federal plan. And that's what we've proposed in our campaign. And that's what Jack Harris's bill is about. This would basically give coverage to everyone in Canada who's got no coverage, who earns less than $60,000. Immediately, they would get coverage. And this would save families thousands of dollars, and it would mean a big difference in their lives. The Liberals, we fought with them to start to consider this. They mentioned it in the throne speech after our fight to say this is a priority. But like many things, they talked about it, but they haven't delivered on it. And they did the same thing with pharmacare. They eventually campaigned on it and then voted against it. So with the Liberals, I don't have confidence that they're going to follow through. And that's why I encourage Canadians, if you want to see universal pharmacare, if you want to see dental care, New Democrats are your only option. We are the ones that are consistently committed to improving our healthcare system. And we've seen time and time again that neither the Liberals nor the Conservatives, nor frankly the Bloc, care about improving access to these universal social programs.
Okay, and sort of gathered this from your answer just now, but will this be something that the NDP continues to push on, whether that be in a election potentially in the fall or going forward, even though as we might see today and as it seems we'll see today, there's really no other party in the country that would support this expansive of a program right now?
Absolutely, we're going to continue with dental care. It's a priority for us. It's important to us. And the idea of standing alone is not something uncommon. We're the only party in the House that voted in favor of taxing the ultra-rich. The Liberals and Conservatives voted against that. We're the only ones that stood on the side of people there. When it came to pharmacare, again, the other parties voted against it. We're the only party that stood up against the big pharmaceutical companies and stood with Canadians. So we're not unaccustomed to standing alone, but we stand with people. And that's what sets us apart. The Liberals stand with the big pharmaceutical companies, same with the Conservatives, they stand with the ultra-rich. We've always known where we stand, and that's with people, that's with working people, that's with families. We're going to stand with them.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. The next question is from Annie Bergeron-Oliver of CTV National News. Please go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Singh. Thank you
there.
for taking my questions. Hi, I just want to talk to you a bit about the farewell speech that your member from Nunavut gave yesterday. Mm-hmm. You know, she said in that speech that she is often stopped by security in the House of Commons, that she doesn't feel safe, that she feels racially profiled, and that happened on a number of occasions when she was in Parliament. And I'm wondering what your reaction is to that powerful speech that you gave yesterday, and how you think that Parliament can be safer and a more welcoming place for Indigenous, Black, and other racialized MPs.
I really appreciate the question, and I want to say the Mumilaaq speech was very powerful, and she spoke with the voice of a lot of people who have been made to feel like they don't belong in politics. Women particularly have consistently been told that they don't belong, and she also raises really a fundamental question about the systemic racism that goes into who people think are actually parliamentarians, because for so long parliamentarians have been older white men. That's what the vision, or that's what the assumption is. And so someone like Mumilaaq really shatters that notion of who a member of parliament is in a good way. And it really speaks to a couple of things. One, we need to be very vigilant and continue to apply pressure on the House of Commons and Parliament to become a more welcoming space for Indigenous people, particularly for women, for racialized people. That's something important. But I think what she also said, and I want to highlight, which was very powerful, is that one of the reasons why she said she felt she didn't belong is because this institution and previous governments and the House of Commons and Parliament have actively denied justice to Indigenous people. They've actively actually created the conditions of injustice. And that was one of her biggest reasons to be an institution that has been contributing to the problems that our people face, is one of the reasons why she cited she didn't feel welcome. I think that's a very powerful speech and a very powerful declaration of what we need to do is to change the direction of government, a government that should be working to bring in justice for Indigenous people, that works for the people of this country, and particularly the First People of this land. That's a very powerful message that she used her last words in Parliament to convey. And I commend the powerful words, the courage it took to share those words, and I hope that they spur action and some changes.
And as my follow-up, it's going to be a two-part question, so I apologize for that.
Sure.
One, what kind of immediate changes do you want to see? You know, a lot of people assume that there will be a fall election, which means there's going to be a lot more people who are coming in potentially. What changes do you want to see so that new members of Parliament coming in and those currently serving feel safer, feel that they can walk through the halls without potentially having security asking them for their ID badges and being racially profiled, as she suggested? And the other thing is, you know, you've now been in Parliament for quite some time. I'm wondering what your experience has been.
My experience has been a great experience on that regard, but I think for many reasons I stand out in a different way and don't fit the same. I don't fall into the same problems that women often face, and that racialized women face. I think that I'm insulated from some of those same concerns, and so that I don't think that my experience is informative because of the differences that I have when we're speaking about my parliamentary experience. But I think we need to just be really vigilant when it comes to, particularly to women and to racialized people, to make sure that steps are taken to make people feel welcome, that they are not being stopped arbitrarily, that this is something that has to be addressed. Mumilaaq raised those concerns and they should be responded to immediately. And I think really the broader vision is making sure Parliament works for people and works for Indigenous people and delivers justice that walks a path of reconciliation that really fixes the problems that Indigenous people are facing. Those are the calls that I have that implement the calls to action, implement the calls for justice from the murdered and missing women and girls inquiry. Those are the things that we need to see happen for real justice, and I call on all parliamentarians to work to that effect.
Operator, next question.
Merci. La question suivante est de Boris Proux. Le Devoir, la parole est à vous.
Bonjour, M. Singh.
Bonjour.
Concernant votre annonce du jour sur la PCRE réduite, j'aimerais savoir jusqu'à quel point vous aimeriez voir la PCRE maintenue à 2 000 $ par mois, sachant qu'il y a à peine 500 cas de COVID-19 au Canada aujourd'hui.
Merci pour la question. Donc, jusqu'à ce moment, ça va continuer jusqu'au mois de septembre. Donc, je pense que ça doit continuer au même niveau
parce qu'il y a plusieurs secteurs qui ne peuvent pas retourner. J'ai parlé avec une chanteuse et son travail s'est complètement arrêté. Elle ne peut pas travailler comme musicienne parce que elle n'a pas les opportunités de travailler. Elle chante dans les événements, les festivals, et tout ça, c'est fini. Donc, on sait que pour plusieurs personnes qui travaillent dans les secteurs artistiques, les musiciennes, les musiciens, les gens qui travaillent dans la culture, dans les arts, les gens qui travaillent dans le secteur du tourisme, et ce sont les gens qui vont continuer d'être impactés par la pandémie. Donc, on doit noter que ce sont des Canadiens, Canadiennes, les Québécois et Québécoises qui vont continuer d'avoir de misère à trouver un emploi ou de retourner au travail à cause de la pandémie. Donc, on doit continuer l'aide à ces gens jusqu'au moment qu'on a vraiment réussi contre cette pandémie.
Merci. Et en suivi, j'aimerais savoir quel est le processus que vous voulez utiliser pour changer la loi. Est-ce qu'il est encore temps de faire des amendements? Craignez-vous pas que ces 30 ne soient pas adoptés avant la fin de la session parlementaire? Et de manière plus générale, est-ce que vous pensez que les différents projets de loi mis de l'avant par les libéraux peuvent encore être adoptés avant mercredi prochain?
OK, merci. Une question importante. Donc, comment on peut régler ce problème, cette coupure que le gouvernement libéral Justin Trudeau vont faire avec la PCRE, la solution, plusieurs options. Il peut modifier maintenant la proposition. Ou deuxièmement, et aussi quelque chose qu'on peut faire, c'est après la mise en œuvre de le budget est fait, on a l'option de mettre une deuxième projet de loi qui corrige ce problème, qui arrête la coupure. Donc, il y a plusieurs options. Et ce qui est clair, c'est que nous, les néo-démocrates, moi comme chef, on est prêt de travailler pour régler ce problème. On est prêt de faire n'importe quoi si c'est un autre projet de loi, si on doit siéger pour plus de temps au Parlement. Les options sont là. C'est vraiment une question de volonté. Donc, jusqu'à ce moment, il me semble que le gouvernement libéral n'a pas la volonté de corriger ce problème. Donc, ça, c'est pourquoi on continue de mettre la pression. J'apprécie énormément la question parce qu'on a presque 2 millions Canadiens, Canadiennes à travers les pays qui dépendent sur la PCRE. Et c'est clair aussi qu'il ne peut pas retourner au travail parce que la pandémie continue, malgré le fait qu'on a des bons signes, les choses sont positives, mais la réalité, c'est les événements sont annulés. On sait que plusieurs festivals sont annulés, donc plusieurs opportunités de travail pour les secteurs touristiques, les secteurs artistiques, les musiciens. Donc, ils ont toujours de la misère. Donc, si ça continue, on doit continuer l'aide.
Et nous allons prendre une dernière question au téléphone opérateur. Opérateur, dernière question au téléphone.
Oui, our last question is from Ashley Burke of CBC News. Your line is open. Please go ahead.
Hi, MPC. Thanks
Hey, Ashley.
I had another follow-up question about the speech.
Sorry, I'm just having a problem with your audio.
And then this is another follow-up question about the speech of Mumilaaq Qaqqaq.
Yep.
Last year, you mentioned you had a different experience, but I'm wondering in particular, what do you think specifically needs to be done to make Parliament a safer workspace and more welcoming to racialized people?
Listening to racialized people, listening to racialized women particularly, this is something that women have raised, and I think we've got to listen to women and listen to their experiences and what can be changed to address their experiences. So specifically, we know that the experience or the perception of women in positions of power is very different from men. People don't perceive that women are in positions of power, often consider women to be staff instead of members of parliament. So understanding that reality and how that would be compounded by being Indigenous and being racialized. So acknowledging that reality and then being very vigilant about responding to that, making sure there is the appropriate consideration of that. In the next parliament, I hope that Indigenous women who are elected are there is a particular effort placed on making sure that they are a priority in terms of whether they're, knowing that that's a member of parliament, knowing that person should not be stopped,
and going above and beyond to account for the fact that for so long a system has been designed to accommodate a certain group of people, but not designed to acknowledge racialized people or women or people that are often not perceived as those in positions of power. I think that perception has to change, and then steps have to be taken to be very vigilant about putting that in place.
And looking back over the last term, do you think that you could have done more or anything more to support MP Qaqqaq?
I count on, or I consider Mumilaaq a friend, and I will continue to be there as a friend and continue to support. I think what Mumilaaq really raised was institutional problems and problems with the House of Commons and the fact that Parliament has been working against the interests of Indigenous people, and how that has made Indigenous people not feel like they've got a place, not just in Parliament, but in Canada. And that is a serious systemic problem that has to be tackled. And what we need to do is really fix the problems. Indigenous people still don't have access to drinking water. Indigenous children are being fought in court. We've got basic human rights that are being denied. Housing, that is something should be something that anyone can count on, is particularly a crisis in Indigenous communities. And in the north and in Nunavut, this is a particular problem. So those are things that need to be done. As a leader, I always try to do my best, and I always look for ways to improve and find ways that I can provide more support to my team. But what Mumilaaq has really raised are some serious institutional problems with Parliament, with the House of Commons, and with the fact that Indigenous people have been denied justice actively by Parliament for so long, by those in power, Liberals and Conservatives, and how that has to change.
And this is all the time we have. This concludes.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. And next up, we have Liberal MPs on Parliament Hill talking about public safety, RCMP, and systemic racism. We all know that systemic racism exists, and we are looking to see what our government is actually going to do about cleaning up the problem from within the systems and root it out and eliminate the causes and change the effects of systemic racism within our society. Having a committee to study it, to figure out what the roots are of it, is a good step. And part of that step maybe should be going to the public, to those who are actually being marginalized by the systemic racism, and see how it affects their lives. Ask how it affects their lives could be another step. But let's listen to what these particular Liberal MPs actually have to say about what is going on with systemic racism, what the committee has done so far. So let's listen in.
Thank you for joining us. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. This morning, our committee tabled a report on systemic racism in policing. Our committee began the study almost a year ago, and today we'll share some of the findings. As Vice Chief Terry Teague from British Columbia Assembly of First Nations explained to the committee, and I'm quoting, "In my language, we call the RCMP Nilchukun, which interpreted in our language is those who take us away. The relationship between police officers and the people they serve is fundamentally about trust. This report tries to offer solutions to rebuild trust and advocate for stronger mechanisms to ensure accountability for officers when they violate that trust. The RCMP must have more effective civilian oversight body. To achieve this, we must properly resource and empower the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP, also known as the CRCC, to better hold the RCMP to account. Professor Kent Roach noted that the CRCC is underfunded and underpowered. This is the lack of trust in the CRCC, which is further compounded by the time it takes the RCMP to respond, and the fact that there is no requirement for the RCMP to implement the recommendations of the CRCC. One of the report's recommendations included creating a statutory timeline for responses by the RCMP Commissioner to the CRCC. Dr. Alan Benson, Chief Executive Officer of Native Counselling Services of Alberta, explained the CRCC needs the power to impose sanctions or consequences. Recommendations in this report state that the Commissioner must be legally required to provide a written response indicating actions have been taken concerning the complaint, and if no action is taken, the reasons why. We also know the CRCC needs to be made more accessible to those who may want to file a complaint. The chairperson of the CRCC herself referred to the process of filing a complaint as, quote, excessively bureaucratic and difficult to navigate. According to Dr. Benson, this makes the complaint process, quote, consequently inaccessible for those who might otherwise file. We agree with the chairperson's assessment and want to see the CRCC become a more diverse organization. Chairperson Leahy suggested that consultations with Indigenous peoples and racialized communities will help identify and break down systemic barriers. By properly empowering the CRCC, faith can be restored in the ability to hold the RCMP to account. We've also made recommendations to make First Nations policing an essential service. Many witnesses articulated the need for Indigenous police services to be made essential services, and the need for an Indigenous policing framework to be established in order to ensure these services are provided. They must have long-term stable funding. We also were cautioned that unless a change to essential service status also includes sufficient financial resources, First Nations policing would not be a success. The committee fully supports designating Indigenous police services as an essential service and stresses the importance that this designation be in conjunction with an increase in spending to ensure that these services are adequately resourced. I'm going to turn now to our chair of our committee, John McKay.
Thank you, Pam, and I appreciate the opportunity to offer a few observations to what I consider to be a very significant report into one of Canada's premier institutions. I tabled this morning, the report was titled Report on Systemic Racism in Policing, and largely focused on the RCMP. Indeed, the Mounties are associated with Canada around the world, and the world associates Canada with the Mounties. However, there is a season and a time for a reckoning for every country and its institutions. This, in my judgment, is a time for Canada to have a reckoning with itself and with its premier institutions. The RCMP was founded as a quasi-military institution, and in some respects has never left that mandate. Canadians, however, are looking for something different, a police service, and therein lies a significant difference. I commend to all those who are reading the report, recommendations number 8 and 9, which encourages the transition from a quasi-military institution to a police service with civilian oversight. Recommendations 1 to 7 deal with the dysfunctional relationship between the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission, CRCC, and the RCMP. Pam was understated in her comments about the dysfunctionality of this relationship. The commissioner for the CRC's requests were not handled in a timely fashion. If they were handled at all, they were handled in an unsatisfactory manner, and frequently any requests or recommendations were left to die. This has to stop. And as chair of the committee, I was struck by the forcefulness of the commissioner for the CRCC and her dissatisfaction with the RCMP. So my colleagues will talk about, no doubt, other elements of the recommendations, all of which I think the committee worked hard on. And I want to recognize the hard work of everyone on the committee. There was a minimum of partisanship and rancor. This committee did what it was supposed to do. It took in evidence, it took in reports, and then produced, after a lot of hard work, the report that you see before you today. So may I recommend to you that report, and hopefully this will constitute a path forward to address the racism in policing in Canada. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, John. Ça m'a fait un grand plaisir de vous joindre aujourd'hui pour parler de deux recommandations en particulier de ce rapport du comité. Tout d'abord, les recommandations 41 et 42 qui s'agit de la question de l'importance des données désagrégées. If we are going to fight and combat systemic racism that exists in institutions such as the RCMP, you have to make sure that you're collecting the data necessary to measure where you are. You just simply can't change what you can't measure. And so I'd like to compliment the members of the Public Security Committee, under the chairmanship of Mr. McKay, and all the members who worked very hard to making sure that they heard from witnesses who were particularly concerned about how to ensure that the path forward will lead to less systemic discrimination, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous policing that could exist, that does exist in our system. You know, we know that our justice and public security institutions have marginalized Indigenous peoples, Black and racialized people in Canada. The overcriminalization of people of color perpetuates systemic racism and leads to worsening outcomes. We must actively seek better ways to move forward. Our government is committed to building a more inclusive Canada, which means we must seek more effective ways to shape policing. Et si je peux juste citer les deux recommandations qui étaient dans le rapport, qui étaient vraiment importantes, c'est que le gouvernement du Canada s'assure qu'une analyse raciale critique soit appliquée à toutes les données policières désagrégées, fondées sur la race, recueillies afin d'éviter que la façon dont elles sont utilisées stigmatisent et marginalisent davantage les personnes racialisées et les autochtones. Ça, c'est une recommandation clé. Et deuxièmement, c'est que le gouvernement du Canada oblige la Gendarmerie royale du Canada à recueillir et à publier les données nationales complètes et désagrégées sur la race couvrant les interactions de la police avec le public. Je peux vous dire que je suis fier que le gouvernement ait déjà entamé du travail dans cette direction. Il faut qu'on continue. Les recommandations de ce rapport vont s'assurer que le Parlement canadien va continuer dans cette même ligne d'action qui est importante si on veut vraiment éliminer le racisme avec nos forces policières. Merci. Maintenant, j'aimerais céder la parole à ma collègue de Saint-Laurent, Cartierville, Emmanuela Lambropoulos.
Merci, Greg. Ce n'est plus Cartierville, c'est juste Saint-Laurent. Ce rapport est extrêmement important. Et puis, comme on le sait, la police agit en tant que gardien du système de justice pénale et son exercice de discrétion détermine en partie quel comportement sera soumis à la criminalisation. Du moment où les agents exercent leur pouvoir de manière raciste, les décisions qui en découlent vont contribuer aux disparités et à la surreprésentation des personnes racialisées et des Premières Nations dans les instances de la justice pénale. Ces groupes d'individus ont des taux d'incarcération plus élevés. De l'avis d'un témoin, les personnes racisées et les Autochtones font l'objet d'une attaque policière, de l'harcèlement et d'un nombre disproportionné de décisions de culpabilité assorties de lourdes peines. De même qu'ils sont sujets à des traitements hors normes dans des instances correctionnelles. Et d'autres ont témoigné qu'il serait important que les services de police soient représentatifs des populations qu'ils desservent et soient un reflet de celles-ci par la diversité. La collecte de données, comme a parlé mon collègue Greg, c'est extrêmement important car c'est comme ça que nous allons pouvoir trouver des solutions aux problèmes qui existent par rapport à ça. Et nous avons aussi trouvé que la culture de la GRC doit changer. Donc, la GRC, présentement, l'entraînement est un petit peu comme paramilitaire et ça doit changer, ça doit devenir plus professionnel. Et aussi, les gens doivent faire l'entraînement dans les communautés où ils vont servir pour vraiment bien connaître les gens qu'ils vont servir et pour qu'ils puissent faire un bon travail. Donc, c'est ça. Ensuite, de plus, l'Assemblée des Premières Nations a suggéré aussi de former les agents de la GRC localement, et ce, dans l'intérêt de ceux qu'ils servent. De plus, il serait pertinent de mettre aussi en place un collège national de police pour assurer une formation spécialisée, professionnelle et fondée sur des données probantes semblables au modèle employé au Royaume-Uni. L'objectif est de fournir à ceux qui travaillent dans les services de police les compétences, les connaissances et les habiletés nécessaires pour prévenir la criminalité, protéger les citoyens et assurer la confiance du public. Donc, je vais passer la parole à Kamal.
Merci, Emanuela. Good morning, everyone. A little over a year ago, death of George Floyd shook the entire world. Knowing full well that Canada is not immune to racism, and after learning the horrifying incidents involving the RCMP and the Indigenous people, my colleagues and I on committee set out to better understand the presence of systemic racism in policing in Canada and the impact it has on Indigenous, Black, and racialized Canadians. I've seen this impact close up in my own community of Brampton, where DeAndre Campbell, a young Black man, and Ijaz Chaudhry, an elderly Muslim Canadian, represent just two of the many stories of people who were taken from their families and communities far too soon. Their deaths were avoidable and serve as a constant reminder of the work that remains. One of the things that we heard throughout this study and was identified as a major challenge for police services was the increasingly number of police interactions in responding to crises related to mental health or wellness checks. The committee heard extensively on the need to have concrete, culturally specific mental health, addiction, and social service support to respond to the crisis or to prevent them altogether. This report makes significant recommendations to the Government of Canada on this to work with provinces and territories, municipalities, Indigenous and racialized communities to ensure adequate funding and service responsibilities related to mental health and victim services, and to encourage the use of personnel specialized in victim services, mental health, who would be available with first responders in situations requiring de-escalation that are tailored to address the needs of the specific communities. Our committee also heard from Peel Regional Police Chief Nish, who has set out to make bold and meaningful changes, shifting from traditional law enforcement methods to a pro-public health model which is rooted in human rights. By teaming up with Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Canadian Mental Health Association, Peel Regional Police is moving in the right direction in showcasing how policing can be done differently in addressing systemic racism. The report highlights and addresses the pervasive nature of racism in policing at its roots. And as a member of Parliament, representing the largest Black community in Canada, I look forward to continuing to work with all parties involved so that we can continue to construct a Canada in which all Canadians, regardless of their race, identity, feel safe at their homes, in their communities. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to MP Fisher.
Well, thank you very much, Kamal, and good morning, everyone from beautiful Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I want to take a quick second. I'm the newest member of this committee, and I wanted to take a moment to thank my colleagues, the colleagues who spoke before me today that did the heavy lifting, the mammoth work to get this report across the finish line. So thank you very much to those folks who spoke before me. Look, it's no secret that Canada's institutions, most of which were born from colonialism, were designed with the cards stacked against Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. We know that this systemic racism continues to persist in these institutions. It continues to persist within the justice system and in police departments right across the country. We know that the government has been paying very close attention to this study, and as our government continues to work towards a more inclusive country, we have to ensure that transforming these institutions is at the forefront of that work. The recommendations in this report are meant to be helpful, not only for our government, but for all orders of government and police departments across the country. It's important that all orders of government step up and tackle this issue within their respective jurisdictions. I thank you very much for attending today, and I will pass it over to Pam to wrap up.
Thank you. There were 42 recommendations in the report. We have not been able to go through all of them in limited time. There's training, recommendations around training, increased diversity, and the importance of consultation with Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and people of color. We hope that this report will serve as a roadmap and a pathway forward for not only the RCMP, but policing services across the country. We feel that a focus needs to be put just as much on human rights as it is on the criminal code, and we're pleased to see that the government has been following our work. We heard from 53 witnesses, we've received 21 briefs, and
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. British Columbia is one of those provinces that decided to keep the doors to the education system open. They didn't close the schools. There was outrage and continued outrage from teachers about the decision not to close the schools. And does the Ministry of Education truly hold the safety of schools at heart? There was a lot of debate over it. There's a lot of outrage on social media, and the Public Health Office and the Ministry of Education seemingly at times would ignore such outcries. Well, today they have announced that an investment of $43.6 million of support to health and safety measures, especially for mental health services, for services serving First Nations and Métis students, and rapid response teams to address all kinds of other learning impacts to students. So why don't we listen to what the Minister of Education for British Columbia has to say, along with she has a few guests with her from the education system to help discuss what this particular type of help means and how they're going to plan out the opening of schools in September.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Whiteside. I'm BC's Minister of Education. I would like to acknowledge I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. Today, we're providing an update on back-to-school planning for September. But before we look at what's ahead, I want to take a moment to extend my profound gratitude to teachers, school staff, and administrators. You have worked with compassion, strength, and determination. You have shown remarkable fortitude and leadership while supporting the changing needs of students throughout this unprecedented year. And I also want to thank parents and families for your tremendous commitment and hard work in ensuring your children have been able to learn in spite of the challenges of the pandemic. Our government has been and continues to be committed to following the direction and guidance of public health and working collaboratively with our education partners and with rights holders. The way we have all worked together throughout this year has been remarkable. I think it really reaffirms the compassionate, resilient, and caring nature of British Columbians. The vast majority of students returned to class full-time this school year. We had school safety plans in place to reduce the spread of COVID, and the evidence shows that these plans were indeed successful. There's no question it was a difficult year, and in some parts of the province, much more challenging than others. Since the start of the 2021 school year, the vast majority of schools in BC have been open and operating every day of the school year. And British Columbians are showing just how much they care about each other by getting vaccinated at amazing rates. It is expected that all eligible British Columbians will have been offered both vaccination doses by September, which is fantastic news. And we will hear more from Dr. Henry on that front in a moment. So what this means is that students will be back in the classroom for full-time in-person instruction and the return to a near normal start to school in September. Based on guidance from the Office of the Provincial Health Officer, students will no longer be grouped into cohorts or learning groups. Pending further public health guidance, it's also expected that current restrictions on gatherings, extracurricular activities, and sports will be relaxed in time for the new school year. And that's good news for everyone. I know that we want to move past the pandemic together, and we're currently moving in the right direction. To support the safe operation of schools and the health and safety of students and staff, today we're announcing a total of $43.6 million. This includes new COVID-specific one-time funding of $25.6 million for the next school year. And that is on top of the $7.1 billion we announced in Budget 2021 to operate K-12 schools in BC. The $25.6 million in new one-time funding will be used to continue enhanced cleaning measures in schools and support the continuation of rapid response teams, and used to support Indigenous students affected by the pandemic, as well as improving mental health services and supports for students and staff to address the impacts of isolation, stress, and anxiety due to the pandemic. Our mental health working group will continue to meet and develop strategies and assess and recommend mental health resources to support students and staff. We know the pandemic has not only impacted mental health, but has also impacted learning and educational equity. Early research is showing that those students most impacted are those who already faced structural barriers, including students living in poverty, Indigenous students, English language learners, and those who need more support in schools. And nothing's more important than addressing inequality and ensuring each and every child reaches their full potential in school. And that's why $18 million will directly address learning impacts to students. While school districts will have some flexibility to use that in how they use that $18 million, we want to ensure that those resources are used to meet local needs, and that funding is intended to assess learning impacts on students due to the pandemic, develop and deliver additional resources to address learning impacts, and to deliver recovery strategies designed by school districts. Guidance on mask wearing in school settings will be confirmed later this summer and will align with broader provincial direction. What will remain the same is that we will expect students and staff to continue to complete daily health checks, stay home when they feel sick, and practice diligent hand hygiene. With more than 50% of children aged 12 to 17 already receiving their first dose of vaccine, and those numbers continue to grow, we can plan for a much more typical school year starting in the fall. Our provincial K-12 steering committee, which is made up of educators, parents, support workers, school leaders, trustees, representatives from the First Nations Education Steering Committee and the Métis Nation BC, as well as public health experts, has been absolutely invaluable in navigating the pandemic and keeping our schools safe this year. We will continue to work with the committee and the BC Centre for Disease Control over the summer to review and finalize health and safety guidelines for the fall. We will continue to follow the guidance and direction of public health and follow the evidence when making decisions. I'm very proud of the work that has been done by everyone to ensure that BC is one of the few jurisdictions to develop and implement a system-wide plan to keep our schools open and safe this school year. That accomplishment and commitment to keeping schools open is a testament to the tireless work of our education and health professionals, along with the dedication of students, parents, and families throughout BC. We're committed to continuing to work together so that we can prepare for a safe and a near normal return to school in September. And now I realize I was remiss earlier on in not acknowledging our guests today. I'm here today with our Provincial Health Officer, Dr. Henry, as well as Stephanie Higginson, President of the BC School Trustees Association, and we're joined as well by Andrea Sinclair, the President of the BC Confederation of Parent Advisory Committees, and you're going to have a chance to hear a little bit from all of them, starting with Dr. Henry.
Thank you very much and good morning. We know that this has been a challenging year, and we've been using that word a lot for everyone. But we have adapted and we've learned a lot about COVID-19 over this past 18 months. And despite all of the challenges, educators, schools have been open, and school staff have supported our children and families across the province. Being in class is more than just education, as important as that is. We know it's about social, physical, emotional, and mental health as well. And it is so, so important. We heard unequivocally when we had to close schools early on, before we had a better understanding of how this virus was transmitted, that it impacted families and communities across the board. And it was important for us to commit to making that a priority as we moved into the fall this year. That the school community is essential to the well-being of families and communities across the province. And I am so proud that working together, we have supported the safe reopening and continued opening of in-class schools throughout this year, this most challenging year. And it really is a testament to the dedication of educators and school staff across British Columbia. But we are now in a time of transition where we can safely restart and get some of those important social connections back together. We are gradually progressing with our BC Restart program with a focus on putting the pandemic behind us and learning how we can move ahead and live with COVID-19 in a way that is much more fulsome than we have been. And the reason we can do this is because we have safe and effective vaccines that are protecting people across British Columbia. Our goal, in particular for our schools, is to get to the point that we can take the same approach that we do now with other communicable diseases, whether it's influenza or measles, where we can manage them on a local basis, on an individual basis, without having those broad impacts on society that we have had this past year. We will continue to actively monitor for COVID and other infectious diseases and work with our schools to make sure they continue to be safe. And we will continue to do that public health work to manage and contain spread in our communities as well. Over the next months of summer, we can start to gradually remove the orders and restrictions as more and more people are protected through immunization. That means by September, we will be back to a much more normal school experience. The safety layers we use today are very important tools in our toolbox, and we will need to be ready to use them if needed as we move into the fall. But some we'll be able to take away, and we've talked a little bit about some of those today. Others will continue. We will always need to clean our hands regularly. We know that's important. Staying home when you're sick, getting tested if symptoms develop. We are on a very good trajectory, but I will reassure everybody we will be watching this carefully and will continue to do so as we move through the summer, and we'll be developing our plans in concert with all of the team at the provincial level to make sure that schools are ready in the fall. Planning will continue to be based on evidence, on data, and on learning as we go. We know that even though we will be emerging from the pandemic, we will still need to watch and manage COVID and other respiratory illnesses in the fall, and we will be updating our health and safety guidelines and advice to schools with the BC CDC as we move through the summer. Public health teams will also continue to work with every single school and with the provincial team to make sure that schools are ready in September for the best possible return to typical in-fall setting as much as we can. To the educators, staff, and administrators, I am so grateful for all that you have put into this year. I know it has been hard in some cases, but you have done this, and it has been so important for our families and our communities. And to parents, thank you for your support as well, even when things were very much in flux through many parts of this past year. It has not always been easy, but the adaptability, resilience, and strength of our school communities and our youth has really shone through here in BC. And finally, I want to say congratulations to those who are graduating this year. This is an experience that was much different, I'm sure, than you were expecting, but it is also something that you have overcome. And in successfully overcoming the obstacles that you did this year, that is something you will take with you for the rest of your life. And know that you have that strength and resilience when things get tough in your future. But I want to say congratulations. You've done an amazing job through a very challenging year, and I think that is reason to celebrate for everybody. Thank you very much. I'll now turn it over to, do you want to introduce, to Stephanie Higginson to say a few words.
Good morning. I'm honored to be on the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And I too want to begin by acknowledging that the COVID-19 pandemic has been hard on all of us. It's been hard on communities, it's been hard on businesses, and it's been hard on families. It has been particularly difficult for children and youth who have lost connections to supports and sacrificed activities and experiences that so many of us remember so fondly from our own formative years. Schools are where we learn. They're where our early social and emotional learning takes place. They are also where we make lifelong connections to friends, to teachers, to mentors, to teams, and activities that shape our lives. In British Columbia, we have been fortunate. Boards of Education, in cooperation with the Ministry of Education and the Provincial Health Office, pulled out all the stops to keep students in school all year long to make sure that learners would benefit from the critical supports provided by schools. We are proud that British Columbia prioritized the health and well-being of children and youth by keeping schools open for the entire school year. Together, we proved that with the appropriate health and safety measures in place, education can and should be a priority even during a global pandemic. It was a monumental task that asked a lot of every person in this sector, and everyone rose to the challenge. And we did so because of how much we care for the students we serve. We are grateful to everyone for the sacrifices they made in recognition of the critical role schools play in the lives of students, communities, and society at large. Thank you to the dedicated staff across the entire K-12 sector who made all of this possible. Each and every one of you played an integral role in this extremely complicated but very successful school year. And thank you to the families and students who worked hard to comply with the safety measures that made this school year possible. It's been extraordinarily difficult, but it has been successful, and this year will set us up for a smoother transition into our recovery phase. And with hope on the horizon, we can look back and feel a tremendous sense of achievement at the incredible efforts we took to keep kids in school during this very challenging school year. Building on this same diligence and care, I am grateful and relieved to be here today delivering a message of hope based on the most up-to-date science that has guided BC so successfully through this pandemic. We are here today to signal the first careful steps towards a pandemic recovery school year. Boards of education will continue to work with their local medical health officers to create return-to-school plans that parallel the province's staged recovery plan. Boards will work with the same thoughtfulness demonstrated this school year to meet the needs of students as we transition to a post-pandemic world. We recognize and we understand that the pandemic has impacted each community differently, and each Board of Education will build a COVID-19 recovery plan that meets the nuanced needs of the communities that they serve. Over the last year and a half, British Columbians in every community pulled together to keep each other safe. As we move forward, boards will continue working with their communities to keep kids learning, growing, and thriving in every part of the province. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I'd now like to turn it over to Andrea Sinclair, the President of the BC Confederation of Parent Advisory Committees.
Good morning, and thank you, Minister Whiteside. I acknowledge I am speaking today from my home on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I'm Andrea Sinclair, and I'm the President of the BC Confederation of Parent Advisory Councils. BC CPAC is the provincially mandated voice of parents who represents over 565,000 students attending public schools. I wish to thank our dedicated board and our CEO. Together, we have attended over 125 meetings since March 2020. I am proud to say BC CPAC has worked diligently to bring the parent perspective and voice to each committee and influence decisions and policies. As has already been noted, it has been a challenging year for us all. I understand these challenges firsthand as I have 2 children in high school. By working together, our schools have remained open and safe. By doing so, children were able to benefit from the social and emotional supports offered at their neighborhood school. It also meant our children were able to have consistency in their lives by ensuring that their daily routines would remain. By schools remaining open, it meant our children could continue to interact with peers and trusted adults. It also allowed our children to take advantage of the much-needed supports like breakfast and hot lunch programs. As I took my place on the K-12 steering and restart committees, I was impressed with how hard parents, educators, support staff, healthcare experts, and ministry personnel worked as a team to ensure that schools met health and safety guidelines. I'm grateful to each of our education partners for their knowledge, effort, and dedication. Through this experience, I am more confident than before that our school system can overcome any adversity it may face. There is no substitute for the in-class experience, and that is why we support the K-12 recovery plan and the return to school in September, where all students can be back learning full-time in their classrooms. Children and families can expect that their school and school district will be prepared, responsive, and flexible in meeting individual student needs, including acknowledging and addressing impacts from the pandemic on learning, mental health, and well-being. It's been a time of adaptation for all of us, children, families, and school staff. It's now time for parents to return to our schools to help reinvigorate our communities. It's now time for parent advisory councils to re-engage with their families. It is important for us to share with families today so that they can plan and adapt for September, but also find time to rest, recharge, and reset over the summer. And as we look with hope to September and the near normal return to school, BCCPAC will continue working with our provincial education partners and the ministry throughout the summer to finalize the plans for September while continuing to take our lead from the PHO. We will keep members and families informed as information is available. We have listened and learned from each other. We have supported and leaned on each other. The phrase, "it takes a village," has never been truer. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Mental health is something that, believe it or not, is more important than what we actually know to keeping someone a productive member of society, to keeping them a happy member of the family, a willing participant in our community. The list could go on about all the different things that happen when somebody has a healthy mental outlook, when they aren't depressed, when they feel wanted and needed in a community, and they feel that their opinion actually counts. There's a lot of different things that add into mental health and mental well-being, as well as inclusion in a community. So the WHO, they ran a webinar on mental health and suicide prevention. Suicide, believe it or not, is one of the biggest killers of the human race. It doesn't need a virus to cross borders. It doesn't need a chemical to cross borders. It is a condition, a serious condition, a life-ending condition that travels the world without any other medium other than thought. People who contemplate suicide, they find themselves hopeless, and there are programs that can be put into place in everyone's community to help people keep from feeling that way. And this is part of what is going to be discussed by this WHO webinar. So why don't we move on to the webinar, listen to what the experts at the WHO have to say, and their panels, and let's try to make our community, our global community, inclusive so that we can help limit the effects of suicide.
My sister was about 33 years old at the time. She was married and she had 4 children. My sister could not access such a service that could have helped her at her time of distress. Had we had such a service as they do in other parts of the world, maybe my sister would not have taken her own life. Maybe she'd have found help.
So when I was 20, I got my diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, and I gave up really quickly. So I was put into a hospital, and I ended up running away from the hospital. I didn't want to live anymore. I didn't see a future with this illness that I had. I ended up on the edge of a bridge, and I was talked off the edge by a stranger. He was walking past, and he stopped to talk to me. And yeah, we had this connection, and I hadn't had that connection with anyone before. And through his openness and his kindness and his sort of patience with me, I started to talk and open up. And eventually he managed to talk me off the edge of that bridge. And then 6 years later, when I was in a much better place, I decided to find him and thank him for what he did. What he did that day, it changed my life. And so to be able to thank him meant so much. I think whether you're the person that's experiencing suicidal thoughts and feelings, or you're the person that's supporting them, the most important thing is to remember that those suicidal thoughts and feelings will pass. They do pass. It doesn't feel like they will when you're in that moment. When you're in that moment, it's so intense, but it does pass. And it passes through, things like distraction or talking it through with someone. But that's the most important thing to remember, that it's just thoughts, it's just feelings, and you don't have to act on them. It feels like you do need to act on them. It feels like that's the only way, but they pass. It's really, really, really key to remember that.
My name is Talinda Bennington, and my late husband was Chester Bennington. He took his life on July 20th, 2017. Chester, he was my heart and soul. He was my best friend. He was my other half, and it affects us pretty much in every aspect of life. His loss does affect us. I think there should be immediate support of local organizations that people can reach out to. I feel like there should be peer support. I think that's really important. I think when the tragedy first strikes, I found it quite hard to reach out. And so if you know of someone that is going through a loss like this, I would reach out, connect, offer help, offer support, offer a cup of coffee. Just be there and be compassionate and non-judgmental.
We have now with us our WHO's Director General, Dr. Tedros, who has on a number of occasions shown his commitment to suicide prevention and the commitment of WHO to this important area of work. So I'd like to pass now to Dr. Tedros for a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Alison. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today for the launch of this very important tool. In 2019, 1 in every 100 deaths globally was due to suicide. Every one of those suicides is one too many. Suicide affects people of all ages, in all countries, from all walks of life. Every suicide is a tragedy that has a devastating impact on families, friends, and communities. That's why suicide prevention is core to WHO's mental health work. And that's why reducing the suicide mortality rate is a key target in the Sustainable Development Goals and in WHO's Comprehensive Mental Health Action Plan. But although there has been a small reduction in the global rate of suicide in the last decade, we're not on track to reach this target. Some countries have seen suicide rates increase, and many are not fully committed to suicide prevention. On top of that, many of the risk factors for suicide, job loss, financial stress, and social isolation have been amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Unless we scale up and accelerate our suicide prevention efforts considerably, many more people will lose their lives. Fortunately, there is hope. Suicides can be prevented if we work together. That's why WHO has developed the Live Life Implementation Guide for Suicide Prevention. This new guide lays out a clear path to putting in place proven interventions to prevent suicide. We're very grateful to be joined today by a unique and inspiring panel of guests. DJ Nash Jazz Toruntan, and Johnny Benjamin. In the next hour, we will hear how each of them, in different ways, are helping people talk about suicide, in doing so, giving people support that can literally be the difference between life and death. Thank you to each of you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you. My thanks also to everyone who worked on the Live Life Implementation Guide. My hope is that all countries will use this guide to save lives and to improve the mental health of millions of people around the world. Because, as I often say, there is no health without mental health. Thank you very much again, Alison, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tedros. Some important words there, and thank you again for your support to this very important area of work. So now I'd like to pass on to our panelists, and our first panelist is Jaz Thornton. So as well as being a mental health activist and co-founder of the NGO Voices of Hope, Jaz was also received an award just a month or two ago for the Young New Zealander of the Year. So congratulations, first of all, Jaz, and thank you very much for joining us today. So my first question to you, Jaz, is can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background for the benefit of our viewers, and why suicide prevention is so important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Jaz Thornton, and suicide prevention for me is an incredibly important part of my life and my work and what I do now. And that's because it's something that I significantly struggled with for all of my teenage years. I went through a lot kind of growing up when I was a child, and the very first time I ever tried to take my own life, I was 12 years old. Throughout the rest of my teenage years, I spent it in and out of psych wards and in and out of hospitals, and wholeheartedly believed that this was just the way that my life was going to be forever, wholeheartedly believed that the world was going to be better off without me in it. And I remember sitting in the intensive care unit of the psych ward and just trying to find stories of other people who had gone through this and had got through the other side. And I remember struggling to find anything. I remember our systems being so broken. I remember struggling to access help because I didn't have a biological family with me. They wouldn't admit me into psych wards at times. And so I think spending so much of my life feeling so alone and battling this, when I finally came out the other side, I was like, if my story can help just one person feel like they're not alone and help just one person know that hope is real and change is possible, then it will be so worth it. And so I chose to dedicate my life to mental health advocacy, both here in New Zealand and around the world, and do whatever I can to help people. For me, that's been mainly through storytelling. I studied directing and have written books, and kind of anything that I can possibly do to get that message out of hope is real and change is possible, and encourage governments to invest into the well-being of their people. So that's a little bit about me and why I do what I do.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Jaz. And you said if you can save one person's life, it will be worth doing what you do. Well, I met you as we met for the first time about 18 months ago, and from what I've seen of your work over that last 18 months, I think you've saved many more people's lives than that from the work that you do. So thank you. Moving now to DJ Nash, who's with us very early in the morning from the US. DJ is a creator and executive producer of the US TV series A Million Little Things. So thanks for getting up so early to join us, DJ. And can you tell us also a little bit about the series and how it came about? Just to unmute yourself, please, DJ.
I don't know how it even got muted. I apologize. Thanks for having me too. My roots are originally in comedy. So that's the writing I'd done in television for about the last 19 years. And then I had a friend who took his life, and it just changed me forever. I used to, I was on this one show, and it just, I don't know if you ever had this type of job where you had to walk at lunch just to psych yourself up for the afternoon. And I would walk every single day, and I just was so aware of, I'm not in a great place, and I just need to walk to get through the day. And one day I ran into a friend of mine, and we both lit up, and it was like, hey. And he said, we should have lunch, totally. And it was, even though it's LA, we meant it. And he said, I'm really busy this week. How about next week? I said, absolutely. And then he killed himself. And I don't think for a minute that our lunch could have saved him, but I do think almost every minute I could have had one more lunch. And I think the effect that loss had on me, it just made me, it was like a wake-up call. And I think I wanted to do a show about a group of friends whose lives are forever changed when they lose the person in the friend group whose life was the most put together on paper. Like me, he was a dad, he was a loving husband, and he just lost his way. In the pilot, we make the comparison to John F. Kennedy Jr. when he was flying on that fateful flight. He lost sight of the horizon. The instruments were telling him which way was up. The clouds came in. He wasn't VFR trained. And so he just lost sight of the horizon, and he didn't trust the instruments. And by the time he realized, he was in a nosedive and couldn't pull up. And I think that's depression. And so it's been an incredible 3 now going on 4 seasons of being able to tell these stories that are coming from such a personal place for me and the other writers in the room.
Okay, thanks a lot, DJ, for that. I'm sure a lot of people watching and looking at the chat, I can see there are people from the US who are watching this today, are familiar with your series.
That's good.
But it's a so it's great to see that. You also made a point that I'd just like to pick up on very briefly, and that's that we can be speaking to even close friends and not be aware that they're really struggling with, be it with depression, with suicidal thoughts, or some other kind of mental health disorder. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of thought and follow-up conversations in order to find out when somebody is really feeling very low. But the importance of those conversations and just to emphasize that sometimes it is very difficult to have those kinds of conversations.
Can I just say one thing? And I try to say this on every panel I'm on, and I almost, and correct me if I'm wrong, but every mental health specialist who I've spoken with has confirmed what I'm about to say, which is asking a friend or someone you know if they're thinking about hurting themselves does not make them more likely to hurt themselves. And I think we're sometimes afraid of having that conversation because what if they say yes? But as that incredible video demonstrates, and I'm sure as we're about to hear, like someone stopping and saying, what's going on? You okay? Sometimes feeling cared about and having someone think about you enough to ask that question is enough to get you out of that nosedive.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, DJ. And indeed, that is one of the myths that people think that about speaking about, that it's not okay to speak about suicide. It absolutely is, and is important to have those conversations. So moving now to our third guest, Johnny. So you will have seen Johnny in the video that we showed at the beginning of the session. So Johnny, he's an author and founder of a youth mental health charity, Beyond, based in the UK. Johnny, we heard a little bit about your story, but can you tell us in a bit more detail what led you to get involved in mental health advocacy and more specifically the suicide prevention side of your work?
Yeah, again, thank you very much for having me. And very similar to Jazz, really, my own personal lived experience growing up. You know, I was 5 when my parents first took me to a psychologist, and so we knew that there was something there from a young age. But you know, when I was growing up,
mental health, it was not talked about at all. I didn't understand it. You know, I was struggling, but, you know, at school, we didn't talk about it once. I just wish that someone would have come into my school and, you know, just talked about, you know, just say it's okay not to be okay. But no one did. And, you know, I then, ended up very unwell with schizoaffective disorder. I was diagnosed with this kind of form of schizophrenia. And I was really unwell for quite a while. It took a long time to kind of get back on track. And I mean, ever since then, it's really been about managing my mental health. You know, I have relapses and, you know, I had to go back into hospital, and suicidal ideation is a problem. It comes up. Yeah, it comes up, and it's something that I have to deal with. I had a relapse last September last year, and that was, you know, that I had to go back into hospital, and that was hard with the COVID restrictions, especially. And I was suicidal again, and it's tough. It doesn't, unfortunately for me, it doesn't, and I know other people might say it doesn't get any easier, you know. Although the difference is that I talk about it now. I think that's the big difference, and it's taken a while to get there with my family, with my friends. It's been such a journey for everyone around me, but I am in a place where we can talk about it more. And, you know, for me, I think why I'm so involved in this is I've met so many people that have been bereaved by suicide. My charity that you mentioned, you know, we've got a youth board, and a number of the young people on the board have lost, particularly parents, to suicide. And, you know, I listen to them, and I've met so many people that have lost loved ones to suicide, and that grief and that pain, and it breaks my heart every time. And I just know that there's so much more that we can do. And, you know, I get so frustrated at the lack of action that we so often see, which is why I'm so happy that this is happening today, and I believe it will make a difference. So thank you again for having me.
Well, thanks a lot, Johnny. And Johnny's testimony is also a reminder that mental health issues can be with us are always with us. We can have times when we're in good mental health, times when we're in bad mental health, but it's something that we need to look after all the time. So that's also an important reminder to us all. I'd like to now pass to Dr. Alexandra Fleischman. So Alexandra has been with WHO's mental health department for a number of years, and she's led WHO's suicide prevention work quite some years now, beginning and she'll correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was 2014 of WHO's first global report on suicide. But Alexandra, we've heard now from our panelists. Can you tell us a bit about the Live Life guidance that we're launching today, and give us an overview of what this means, what this approach is to suicide prevention?
Yeah, thank you. Live Life is about implementation. There are effective evidence-based interventions. We know that they work to prevent suicide. So Live Life has 4 key interventions to start with, and these should be implemented in all countries. So there is the limitation of access to means of suicides like pesticides, firearms, medications, and countries need to put into place the legal provisions so that the means restrictions can be achieved. For example, there are pesticides, and they account for 1/5 of all the suicides in the world. So the ban of acutely toxic, highly hazardous pesticides is recommended. Then we have the interaction with the media for responsible reporting. And this is important because the way a suicide is reported can lead to more suicides, but also when there are stories of hope reported, or when it's a story about how someone was coping with their problems, how someone found help, or how help was offered to someone, then these stories can actually help prevent suicide. And then there is the fostering of coping skills and problem-solving skills in adolescence. When we know the fact that suicide is the third leading cause of death for young women and fourth for young men, then it is very clear that schools have to implement those school-based programs. And then we have, of course, the health sector response. So this is about early identification, assessment, management, and everyone who made a suicide attempt should be followed up. And those who are left behind, those bereaved by suicide, they need support. So through the universal health coverage, there's a strong boost to have access to healthcare. But at the same time, there's still a lot of training needed so people get the help they need. And so these are the 4 key interventions of Live Life, and they're accompanied by some foundational pillars that need to be in place, like a multi-sectoral collaboration, awareness raising, also the data and surveillance. And so in the Live Life guide that is launched today, we try to, in a very practical way, to address each pillar and intervention and to explain the what, why, when, where, and how to implement it. And there are many tips for implementation, and there are 73 case examples from countries around the world to use as examples. So this is our guide, which is launched today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra, for providing a little bit more information and detail on the different strategies of the Live Life approach. I think it's worth mentioning at this point, as Alexandra mentioned, the important role of governments in implementing, establishing and then implementing suicide prevention programs, that currently there are only 38 countries in the world which are known to have suicide prevention strategies. But of course, there's much more that can be done aside from having a national strategy at a local level, at a regional level, with the type of groups that Jazz and Johnny lead. And in fact, I was just looking briefly through some of the comments in the chat. Quite a few people who are joining us today are actually involved in suicide prevention work themselves, either as in peer support groups or other health groups. I just want to pick up on the last strategy that you mentioned, Alexandra, and go back to Jazz now. The last strategy, as a reminder, is basically early identification, assessment and follow-up of people who are at high risk. Can you tell us from your own experience, Jazz, with many young people in New Zealand and beyond, why this is so important?
It is so incredibly important. I know for a fact that if I had been offered proper help the very first time that I ever tried to take my life as a 12-year-old, it probably could have prevented the many years that I struggled with it, or at least given me the tools to know how to handle it. But instead, I was given a 15-minute appointment and then a phone call afterwards, and that was it. And what I've seen consistently in my work, I have ended up often at the hospital ED with young people who have tried to take their own lives, and we see time and time again them waiting for hours and hours and hours and then just being discharged with someone saying, oh, we'll call you. And then about a month later, they're back in the emergency department again. And we are seeing this time and time again, not just here in New Zealand, but around the world. People that are basically, I feel that our governments are saying that unless you are very rich or you are dying, you don't get help. And that's what it feels like. You get told, oh, you have to come back when you're in crisis. I've had a young person be told, we can't do anything until you've tried to kill yourself. And that's what is happening, and that's not okay. Early intervention is key. Early intervention will save lives. But at the moment, we're not doing that well enough, and it is costing us, our friends, our family, our loved ones, because people are not listening to the urgency of early intervention and actually wrapping around proper support. That's not just a phone call, because you wouldn't do that if someone was about to have a heart attack. Say, oh, come back attack once you've had a heart attack. So why do we do that with mental health? That's got to change.
Yeah, thanks a lot for those really important points, Jazz. And it might be worth mentioning that a month or two ago, WHO released in collaboration with UNICEF our Helping Adolescents Thrive guidance, again, which is really to help not only governments, but also organizations that work with adolescents and schools put in place a health promotion programs, and particularly on mental health, to help young people build those skills, the life skills that help them to deal with adversity. Moving on, I'd like to come back to DJ. So I'm assuming, DJ, when you started to have the idea of producing a television series about the theme of suicide, you talked to quite a few people about how to ensure that suicide was portrayed in a sensitive way. Can you tell us a bit about that process, who you talked to and how they supported that creative process?
It's so perfect that you're asking this question right now, because I was just looking at the chat and I'm reading someone wrote, here in the US, suicide is now the second leading cause of death for young people, which breaks my heart. And then I was looking at who may have written that, and that is our consultant, Dr. Barbara Van Dalen. So what are you doing up so early, Dr. B? The other, when I wanted to do the show, I am friends with Mike and Anna Shinoda. And they're just incredible people. And Mike had lost his bandmate Chester to suicide. And I was just hesitant to tell him what I was working on, only because I know his life was obviously forever changed and turned upside down by the loss of Chester. They have been such incredible friends and so supportive of the show. They introduced me to Linda, who, seeing her in the video, she's just incredible. She's such a, I'm so curious to see what her life may have been like before this. It's a horrific thing that happened, but she is just showing her true grit, and I am so inspired by her. The three of them introduced me to Dr. Barbara Van Dalen, who is our consultant, and Dr. B has been just incredible. We go through every script together. I had made the pilot before she was our consultant, and so we watched it together, and she gave me such important advice about how to responsibly tell a story. So we did an episode in our second season that featured a young man who was on a roof contemplating jumping, and we didn't break for commercial in the middle of that, where you might be tempted to go, stay tuned. And we really just made sure that we were telling the story. We're very aware that anyone watching our show may have lost someone to suicide. Anyone watching our show may be struggling with thoughts of depression or suicide. And it's so important that when you are telling a story that may trigger people, to tell that story responsibly. So not breaking an act in the middle of the event was key. I think also showing people reaching out and getting help. So even in our second episode, Rome, in the beginning of our show, one of our characters is about to take his life when he gets a call from a friend that their other friend has taken his life. So the show is just about, it's not about one friend dying, it's about the saved life, and it's about 7 friends finally living. So even things like that, where our approach to the topic is with optimism and with hope, I think is really important. And, I even have this serious tone in my voice this morning talking about this, and I know that's probably appropriate, but comedy is not, they're not mutually exclusive. I think probably Jazz and Johnny, who have so openly shared their own struggles, I think comedy is a great distraction. I think it's also an important tool to know that, hey, I'm going to laugh a little bit because those clouds are going to part and the sun will shine again.
Okay, thanks, DJ. It's very helpful comments that I'm sure will be not only interesting but useful to a lot of the people that are that are listening to us today. And when the session is over, and in the coming days, we will send a recording to everyone that's registered. I think we can add a link as well to a very short guide that was produced a couple of years ago now, which was basically intended for filmmakers and others that are working in the entertainment industry, with some tips, the types of tips that DJ's just shared with us about ensuring that if you are going to cover suicide as an issue, whether it be a TV series, a play, or something else, that you do it in a sensitive way that it isn't going to cause harm. Moving on now to Johnny, and I wanted to come back to one of the other strategies that Alexandra mentioned when she listed the 4 key strategies in Live Life, and that's promoting mental health among young people and ensuring that they have the life skills to be able to deal with difficult situations in life. So, Johnny, can you tell us a little bit about your charity or your organization that supports young people and what that work involves?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jazz mentioned the word early intervention and prevention before. That's the key with our charity. It's all about getting in there early. The one thing I will say, though, that I find in the UK at least, is that there's just so much academic pressure on young people, and particularly, with the pandemic in the UK, young people are coming back to school, and some young people are really struggling with their mental health, which is understandable. And teachers as well are really struggling. But what I'm seeing, my charity is seeing, is that there's so much academic catch-up pressure from the government. And I know the UK is not alone in this, other governments as well. They put so much pressure on these schools in terms of the academia. And so the mental health gets kind of left behind, and it needs to stop. And I think what I find, and again, I get really frustrated. I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit of a rant, but mental health is often a tick box thing, I find, in a lot of schools, workplaces. It's like, right, okay, we've done one session around mental health, right, we're done. And it really frustrates me, with the charity, we get asked to come into schools and 30 minutes, we're given a 30-minute slot. And, then the children, the young people are just expected to go back to class and study. And it's like, we have to give time. We have to give proper time to this if we really want to make a difference. I want to see schools, if we really want to implement this, schools need to make time in their timetables, and it not just be like once in 6 months, we talk about this, we do this. And this needs to really come from the top, from the head teachers, from the senior leaders, and from the government. The government needs to stop putting so much, academic pressure on, and put real valuable time into our curriculums for this, because otherwise things won't change. It's all very well like saying, oh, we're gonna do this, we're gonna just add this in somewhere where we can slot it in. No, we need to carve out proper time, as we do for other subjects within school, whether it's maths or languages or history. When we learn about history, we carve out time. It's really important. Well, our mental health, young people's mental health, is as important, if not more important. So sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but I just think it's really important that we put a bit of pressure on the people at the top in these countries, the governments, to change their way of thinking, because we know that 3/4 of all mental health issues begin in adolescence. So it doesn't make sense why that's not mental health isn't such a big part of young people's kind of curriculum in education growing up. It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, thanks, Johnny. I mean, the message is obviously there that it's not enough to pay lip service to mental health promotion. It's a topic that needs to be taken seriously, not just by the health sector, but by many other sectors of society, whether it's the care sector, so social services, whether it's the education sector, whether it's the business sector, because people are affected in all walks of life and at all ages. I'd like to turn now to questions that have come in on the chat, because we've got quite a few now, and it's great to see that we've got people joining us from all over the world. Just to mention a few countries: Nepal, Iraq, Cameroon, US, Kenya, Pakistan, Trinidad and Tobago. So thanks all of you for joining us today. The first question I want to take is from Winter from Ireland, and it's a question for Jazz. And she says, or he says, how have you been able to get your government's attention on mental health? And do you have plans to spread this more worldwide to other governments around the world?
I think a very, very good question and very important one. For us, the kind of getting government's attention wasn't something that we were able to kind of do overnight. It was a lot of kind of working on the ground, getting into the local radio stations and getting the local newspaper on board and beginning to kind of start the conversation around mental health. And when we were first starting, it had just been released that New Zealand had the highest youth suicide statistics in the developed world. And so we were kind of able to start making some noise. And eventually when we stuck at it long enough and we kept going and we kept talking about it, more people started listening and more people started opening up about their own stories. And eventually it was front page of our major newspapers about our this kind of epidemic that we're in of suicide, and TV stations were talking about it and radio was talking about it and our country was talking about it so much to the point that when it came to our elections, everyone was kind of watching what our government was going to do on mental health. And that's how a lot of people voted, because of the fact that there was so much noise about it from the ground. And I think that's really important, is that you can gather people that have the same heart as you for it, that can see the issue, that refuse to take no for an answer, and you just keep pushing and you just keep going, and eventually governments will have no choice but to listen. And it was after all of this noise that our government released the world's first ever wellbeing budget, and we saw $1.9 billion invested into mental health. And so it was something that we started very much from the ground, and managed to get their attention. But it's still a continuous thing of trying to get them to listen and to listen to the lived experience voices. And it's definitely something that we are looking at globally, across, how we can be helping each other. There's things that people are doing in Sierra Leone, for example, with lived experience advocacy panelists and boards and governings that they've got together that we don't have here. And so looking at it collectively, I think there's answers out there. We just have to work together to find them.
Thanks, Jazz. And just in follow up to that question, I would just like to give a shout out to our friends and partners in the UK, United for Global Mental Health, because it was thanks to them actually that we got to know Jazz and got together with a number of other people who are doing similar work to Jazz in other countries around the world, and are really creating a very powerful advocacy network on mental health and also suicide as well. So if you're watching, United, thank you. Okay, another question. So Alexandra, this one's for you, and maybe it's something we should have started with, although there's not one answer to it. And that's a question of what are the causes of suicide, or the factors influencing suicidal thoughts and behaviors?
Yeah, as much as there is not only one intervention, there are a number of different risk factors that need to be taken into consideration. So, of course, there are mental health issues. Of course, we know about depression and alcohol use disorders and their association with suicide, for instance. However, there are also other issues like experiences of loss in your life. It's, a breakup of a relationship, loss of a loved one. So this can be a risk factor, but also experience of violence or trauma, interpartner violence, for instance. So also loneliness, also loss of employment. Now with COVID-19, of course, there's a great concern about economic downturn and this impact, which would then only play out later on. And so different risk factors need to be looked at and taken into consideration. And the important thing is that if there's one risk factor at play, one should already ask about suicidal thoughts and then follow up with that. And if there are many or several risk factors together, of course, then the risk increases.
Okay, thanks, Alexandra. It comes back to what was said earlier about the importance of having these conversations about suicide and not being afraid to actually broach the topic. I have another question for Alexandra. So there have been quite a few comments and questions coming in about the difference in high-income and low-income countries, and this one is specific to Live Life and the guidance that's provided in the document being released today, and that is. Are there different approaches that are recommended for high-income and low-income countries? And how do countries that have fewer resources, how are they able to implement some of the recommendations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, this is similar with risk factors. They're the same risk factors all over the world. However, in different contexts or cultural backgrounds, the one or other may be more or less important. And so with the interventions, the 4 key interventions in the Live Life guidance are really the ones to start with, the ones that apply to every country. However, there will be nuances necessary, for instance, with the access to means. So a country would need to know in their context what are the main means used, and then intervene and restrict, if possible, access to that means. With pesticides, these are found in low and middle income countries in agricultural areas where they're just in the household right there, readily, easily accessible. But in other countries, it may be different means that are more important. So you really, you have the general message on how to get started, but then you have to look at your particular situation in your country, and you have to look at the health service, what is already available. You may involve non-specialized health workers. You may involve people in the community to also early identify and follow up with people at risk. So there's some context adaptation necessary.
Okay, I'm jumping around a little bit, but just scanning the questions that are coming in on the chat. And this is a question for you, DJ, and it comes from Kevin, who says, I'm currently developing a peer-powered mental health resource that I've named our Mental Health Club. Part of our mandate is to engage the entertainment industry in how their stories and other media can best represent fair and accurate portrayals of mental illness. Do you have any advice for us?
Wow. I came about this story in a really different way because I was just trying to tell a story of something that really happened to me. It's a different approach. So I love that the show has allowed people to have conversations that they weren't previously having, or to continue conversations they're having, and to feel seen. But my thing is just get up every morning and write what you know. So maybe that applies to what Kevin's doing, where he can continue to just tell his story and to trust that people will see it. I just know from my own experience, I didn't try to capture everyone's story. I really wanted to tell such a specific story. I grounded it in the people I knew and the experiences I had, and they just touched on universal themes. So I think my advice would just be, it sounds like he's doing the right thing, and soon people will notice. The other thing I'll say is, you mentioned the pandemic and the causes it has on all of these really difficult issues. In our show, we debated whether or not to include COVID in our storytelling. And for about 12 minutes, we considered not doing that. And then it was just so clear, how can you not, when mental health is affected by feeling isolated, by financial troubles, by medical issues, by this, just basically all of the causes and repercussions of COVID only increase it. On a positive note, as a writer, I'm always looking for that segue, the way to talk about something or to justify a character giving a speech or saying something. Yes, okay, I know I wanted to say that, but how do you make that feel earned or feel organic? This pandemic has allowed us to call anyone and go, hey, how have these last 16 months been for you? How you doing? I know I'm having a tough time. And so that the thing I said earlier about don't be afraid to have the conversation, now we have the way to get there. And you can go like, whew, how about I haven't seen my family in over a year. I know how tough that is on me. How are you doing? And maybe someone will have an opportunity to talk about the pain they're feeling.
Thanks a lot, TJ. And really, you know, this point about talking to people who have lived experience and have gone through this experience in one way or another. You talked earlier about talking to the band members of Linkin Park and to Linda, and the advice that you got from Dr. Barbara. I mean, these are all things that people who are thinking about embarking on this topic in the entertainment industry in any way can do to ensure that what they do is portrayed in a responsible way. So we're coming towards the end of the hour now. Time for one or two more questions. First of all, one to Jazz, and this is about posting on social media. And obviously, this is a tricky but very, very pertinent question. And this is from Chantal, and she says, how can advocates post on social media without triggering somebody into attempting suicide? So I would you like to take a stab at answering that?
Yikes. Yeah, I mean, I know that I'm always very, very careful about what I post. I'm very thankful that social media was not a massive thing when I was in the peak of my illness. I think that social media can be super dangerous and you have to be so careful on the messaging. I always try to ensure, especially if you're thinking about it on an advocacy point, that at all times, no matter what the story is that you're telling, you always have to add hope into it, that you can be raw, you can be real, but you also must be, you must provide hope. You must be able to say that change is possible, even if the thing that you're directly talking about is very and really raw. It's you've got that you're always combating with hope, and I ensure that I do that in everything that I post, and I will often make sure that I'm not impulsively posting and I'm actually thinking things through before I put it out, because as soon as it's out in the world, people are seeing it and we're responsible for what we put online. So ensuring that we're taking time to actually consider what we're posting. I don't ever put anything up without kind of checking over it and making sure that I'm thinking of everyone who was vulnerable and thinking, would this have been something that would have caused more damage than good? And if the answer to that, and you don't know the answer to that, don't post it, is kind of my thoughts on it.
Thanks, Jess. That's good advice. So the last question before we wrap up is to Johnny. And Johnny, so question here is, what inspired you to start writing your first book? I mean, the question could be posed to both Johnny and Jazz, but I'm going to ask this one to Johnny.
Yeah, thank you. Before I answer that, can I just say actually something I don't know, a word that I don't know if we've mentioned so far is listening. Mm-hmm. That's so key. It really is. I mean, with my friends, particularly my male friends, a lot of them have really struggled during the pandemic, and I'm really trying to be there and to really, really, really listen. I mean, it takes, we don't learn to listen growing up, do we? We learn to quickly respond, and especially in this world that we live in, with all meetings online, it's just so fast paced, and we don't listen to each other, and we don't take the time, and we don't give each other space. And I think that's so key. I know, for example, some workplaces, what they're doing is before they go right into their meeting, they open Zoom, they go right in, they take a pause, and they actually ask each other how they are, or they'll start their meetings going for a walk with a colleague and just asking, because sometimes it's hard to look someone in the eyes and open up. So we need to be thinking more about, particularly again with the pandemic, like giving people space and time and listening, really listening. I just wanted to say that. But yeah, I think, it's been therapeutic for me. It's been cathartic for me. I'm sure Jazz will say the same, to when you hide something for such a long time, when you suppress something for so long, and then you finally have the chance to, open up. It's so liberating. And so many, and I've been trying to read all the comments, and so many people here are suicide survivors, and they, when you've been through something and come out the other side, particularly mental health, and you've had to deal with the stigma and the shame and the silence, you just want to help people. You just don't want anyone else to go through what you went through. And, there's some amazing people on this chat that I've been reading, setting up their own organizations, and it's incredible. And that's why I wrote my books, to try and just reach someone. And, as Jazz said, if you just reach one person, I mean, it's worth it. But I really like the term wounded healer when we talk about people that have mental health issues, lived experience. They have such wisdom and such insight if you've been through that. And I do believe that people that have been through it and come out the other side, they do have the power to heal other people. That's why things like peer support is just so valuable. So again, sorry, that's a bit of a ramble, but I think just want to reach as many people as possible, just to try and make a difference to someone.
Well, thanks, Johnny. And listening, you're right. It's important to make that point before we close this, because that's how it all starts, of course. To have conversations, you need to listen to, or actually not just listen, but watch and observe how people are acting, and body language, etc., etc. So coming towards the end now, to wrap up, well, as Johnny just mentioned, for those of you that have been scanning down the chat during the course of the hour, there are a lot of people joining us who are indeed suicide survivors. So thank you for being with us today. There are also a lot of people who are working in this field, suicide prevention activities, or mental health more broadly. So again, we hope you found today useful. You can find the new materials on the WHO website. We will put the links in the message that goes out to everybody that's joined us today in soon after the close of the event. But lastly, just to come back to a few words that we've heard throughout this last hour, and that's optimism, hope, and something Jazz said, change is possible. These are things that if we want to leave on some key messages today, I think that's what they would probably be. There is hope. If you are really struggling, there is hope. Change is possible. And if you are struggling, then reach out for help. That's so important. So thanks today. It's been great. For those of you that we've known it already know, it's been great to see you again. Very nice to meet you, DJ. We really appreciate you not only making the time, but making the time at a really early hour in your day.
And just woke up. Do we have any questions? Okay.
And now we can see why DJ started out in comedy. So thank you, everybody, very much for joining us. We hope you found it useful. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening today, and thank you for supporting us with our sponsors. Please go to depictions.media for more information, and click on our contact link and let us know how we can help bring your story and help bring us to a better world. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.